the literary significance of the story. Welcome back, friends. I'm Annabelle, and I'm here to read. Every week, first we read a piece of classic literature together, and then we talk about it. If you would like to follow along, down in the video description box there is a copy of a free ebook, along with links to other source material and a link to the author's biography. You'll also find a link to subscribe down there. How did that go? Oh my god! This week we are reading After 20 Years by O. Henry. The policeman on the beat moved up the avenue impressively. The impressiveness was habitual and not for show, for spectators were few. The time was barely 10 o'clock at night, but chilly gusts of wind with a taste of rain in them had well nigh depeopled the streets. Trying doors as he went, twirling his club with many intricate and artful movements, turning now and then to cast his watchful eye adown the Pacific thoroughfare, the officer, with his stalwart form and slight swagger, made a fine picture of a guardian of the peace. The vicinity was one that kept early hours. Now and then you might see the lights of a cigar store or of an all-night lunch counter, but the majority of the doors belonged to business places that had long since been closed. When about midway of a certain block, the policeman suddenly slowed his walk. In the doorway of a darkened hardware store a man leaned, with an unlighted cigar in his mouth. As the policeman walked up to him, the man spoke up quickly. "It's all right, officer," he said, reassuringly. "I'm just waiting for a friend. It's an appointment made 20 years ago. Sounds a little funny to you, doesn't it? Well, I'll explain if you'd like to make certain it's all straight. About that long ago, there used to be a restaurant where this store stands, Big Joe Brady's restaurant." "Till 5 years ago," said the policeman. "It was torn down then." The man in the doorway struck a match and lit his cigar. The light showed a pale, square-jawed face with keen eyes and a little white scar near his right eyebrow. His scarf pin was a large diamond, oddly set. 20 years ago tonight," said the man, "I dined here at Big Joe Brady's with Jimmy Wells, my best chum and the finest chap in the world. He and I were raised here in New York just like two brothers together. I was 18 and Jimmy was 20. The next morning I was to start for the West to make my fortune. You couldn't have dragged Jimmy out of New York. He thought it was the only place on earth. Well, we agreed that night we would meet here again exactly 20 years from that date and time, no matter what our conditions might be or from what distance we might have to come. We figured that in 20 years each of us ought to have had our destiny worked out and our fortunes made, whatever they were going to be." "Sounds pretty interesting," said the policeman. "Rather a long time between meets, though, seems to me. Haven't you heard from your friend since you left?" "Well, yes, for a time we corresponded," said the other. "But after a year or two we lost track of each other. You see, the West is a pretty big proposition, and I kept hustling around over it pretty lively. But I know Jimmy will meet me here if he's alive, for he always was the truest, stanchest old chap in the world. He'll never forget. I came 1,000 miles to stand at this door tonight, and it's worth it if my old partner turns up." The waiting man pulled out a handsome watch, the lids of it set with small diamonds. 3 minutes to 10, he announced. "It was exactly 10 o'clock when we parted here at the restaurant door." "Did pretty well out west, didn't you?" asked the policeman. "You bet. I hope Jimmy has done half as well. He's kind of a plodder, though, good fellow as he was. I've had to compete with some of the sharpest wits going to get my pile. Man gets in a groove in New York. It takes the West to put a razor edge on him." The policeman twirled his club and took a step or two. "I'll be on my way. I hope your friend comes around all right. Going to call time on him sharp?" "I should say not," said the other. "I'll give him half an hour at least. Jimmy's alive on Earth. He'll be here by that time. So long, officer." "Good night, sir," said the policeman, passing along on his beat, trying doors as he went. There was now a fine cold drizzle falling, and the wind had risen from its uncertain puffs into a steady blow. The few foot passengers astir in that quarter hurried dismally and silently along with coat collars turned high and pocketed hands. And in the door of the hardware store, the man who had come 1,000 miles to fill an appointment, uncertain almost to absurdity, with a friend of his youth, smoked a cigar and waited. About 20 minutes he waited, and then a tall man in a long overcoat, with collar turned up to his ears, hurried across from the opposite side of the street. He went directly to the waiting man. "Is that you, Bob?" he asked, doubtfully. "Is that you, Jimmy Wells?" cried the man in the door. "Bless my heart!" exclaimed the new arrival, grasping both the other's hands with his own. "It's Bob, sure as fate. I was certain I'd find you here if you were still in existence. Well, 20 years is a long time. The old gone, Bob. I wish it'd last, so we could have had another dinner there. How's the West treated you, old man?" "Bully. It's given me everything I asked it for. You've changed lots, Jimmy. Never thought you were so tall, by 2 or 3 inches. Oh, I grew a bit after I was 20. Doing well in New York, Jimmy?" "Moderately. I have a position in one of the city departments. Come on, Bob, we'll go around to a place I know of and have a good long talk about old times." The two men started up the street, arm in arm. The man from the West, his egotism enlarged by success, was beginning to outline the history of his career. The other, submerged in his overcoat, listened with interest. At the corner stood a drugstore, brilliant with electric lights. When they came into this glare, each of them turned simultaneously to gaze upon the other's face. The man from the West stopped suddenly and released his arm. "You're not Jimmy Wells," he snapped. 20 years is a long time, but not long enough to change a man's nose from a Roman to a pug." "It sometimes changes a good man into a bad one," said the tall man. "You've been under arrest for 10 minutes, Silky Bob. Chicago thinks you may have dropped over our way and wires us she wants to have a chat with you. Going quietly, are you? That's sensible. Now, before we go on to the station, here's a note I was asked to hand you. You may read it here at the window. It's from Patrolman Wells." The man from the West unfolded the little piece of paper handed him. His hand was steady when he began to read, but it trembled a little by the time he had finished. The note was rather short. "Bob, I was at the appointed place on time. When you struck the match to light your cigar, I saw it was the face of the man wanted in Chicago. Somehow I couldn't do it myself, so I went around and got a plainclothes man to do the job. Jimmy." The end. I feel like O. Henry's stories, after you read them, you just kind of need a second to, yell. So feel free to pause the video. After 20 Years was published in the 4 Million Anthology in 1906, and this contains most of O. Henry's most famous work, including Gift of the Magi. And it's weird because O. Henry is known as being another one of the American Literary Regionalists who write literature based on, a particular small geographic location. But all of O. Henry's works are in New York City, which is not exactly known for being a small geographic location. But I feel like the title of this book really kind of goes to show how he's a regionalist. O. Henry was reading the newspaper at one point, and there was an editorial in the paper that said that there were only around 400 people worth knowing in New York City. And of course, those people were, the Waldorfs, the Astors, Edith Wharton and her cohort, the wealthy elite, socialite, throwing galas. Those people are the only people worth knowing in New York City. But there was a census going on at roughly the same time that said that there were 4 million people living in New York City, and O. Henry kind of took it upon himself to show that these other 4 million people also had very interesting stories to tell, very interesting lives to lead. And it's funny because at the time, he was kind of seen as being in direct contrast to Edith Wharton for this exact reason, because almost all of Edith Wharton's stories, there's this element, this is such a digression, but it almost reminds me of the TV show Friends, where they're just these 20-somethings living lives which, if you stop and think about it for a second, they are far outstripping the wealth of anyone in that situation, even at that time. And in most of Edith Wharton's stories, they don't really go to explain how these people are living their lives, you know what I mean? You need money for rent and food and clothing, and none of Edith Wharton's stories deal with that struggle, which is pretty universal for most of us. But O. Henry tends to highlight people who do have those struggles, which are a little bit more accessible and universal to people who aren't Edith freaking Wharton. Gift of the Magi is framed around financial hardship, right? It's not oh, I need to get a Christmas present, I don't know what to get him. It's, I know exactly what I want to get him, I'm freaking broke. And even when she's not writing these characters who are, just randomly kind of sort of wealthy, she writes a lot about loftier ideas. She writes a lot about legacy, and O. Henry writes a lot about kind of earthy conflict, you know what I mean? In Gift of the Magi, that conflict is financial, but in After 20 Years, the conflict is, do you betray your friend who has been doing something terrible? I feel like that's kind of a universal thing. Not necessarily that your BFF from when you were in high school is a mob lord. What is that even called? A gang? I'm as out of touch as Edith Wharton on gang hierarchy, I guess. Mob hierarchy. But I think we've all had that experience where we were friends with somebody in our past, and then we've met up with them later, and it's what path did you take to get to where you are, as opposed to the path that I took to where I am? And that kind of conflict between the past and the present, and wanting to honor who you were and where you came from, but also having the morality and the ethics to reject that at the same time. I feel like that is a kind of conflict which really cuts across class barriers for the most part. And O. Henry is also kind of known as the king of twists. Sorry, M. Night Shyamalan, but this one is very twisty, and that's part of why I really dig it. I feel like even if you don't necessarily identify with that conflict that we were discussing, just the twist alone it's worth it. We read a lot of stories on this channel where it's yes, the literary significance of the story, but we don't always read stories that are just enjoyable. And I think that there's room for both, even if there's not a ton of literary merit per se. I think this one's just fun too, right? I mean, as fun as the mob can be. So as always, please let me know what you thought about this one, because I just think it's fun, even though it involves the mob and betrayal and cops. It's fun. It's a romp. But if you liked it, please let me know so that I know what you like, and then maybe we'll read more like this next time. Hope to see you then.